next session, which is session number 4, I believe. And for those who are here, most of you I think have been here for most of the conference, but to newcomers, my name is Elizabeth, and of course I'm a member of Socialist Action, and I'm the chair of the conference. Okay, Julius, I'll pay you later, okay, that money? Check, yeah. I'm a retired postal worker. Check is in the mail. All right.
Can I grieve them?
You can grieve anything you want, John. Won't go anywhere, but you can grieve it. Okay, all right, let's get serious. The title of this session is Fake News. Who's the real culprit? And our speakers today, and they will speak in this order, is Comrade John Wunderlich. He's an executive member of the Toronto Danforth NDP, was its president recently, and he works as a privacy issues consultant. Our second speaker will be Comrade and brother Yves Engler, and Yves has been dubbed as Canada's version of Noam Chomsky, according to the Georgia Strait paper. One of the most important voices on the Canadian left today. This is what they're saying. Briar Patch, and in the mold of I.F. Stone, Globe and Mail. Oh my goodness, even the Globe and Mail. Yves, based in Montreal, is the author of 8 books on Canadian foreign policy, and one of them, guess what, is on hockey. Not about Montreal Canadiens, I hope. His latest book is A Propaganda System, How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And our third speaker is Comrade Jeff Mackler. He's the National Secretary of SAUSA, and he was its candidate for President of the U.S. in 2016.
Wow.
A very famous man here. And he heads up the campaign for Mumia Abu Jamal, and he's also on the National Steering Committee of UNAC, which is the United National Anti-War Coalition, I do believe is what it stands for. So each speaker has up to 20 minutes. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to John.
Thank you, sister. Welcome, comrades, brothers, sisters. Fake news. Who's the real culprit? Capitalism. Can we go now?
Yep, that's it. You're finished.
I'm going to take my time to try and frame the discussion and leave the deep dives to the subject matter experts to my left, perhaps to my left. Some definitions to consider.
At least physically speaking.
News, information about recent events or happenings. Journalism, the profession or practice of reporting. Propaganda, the systematic propagation of a doctrine or cause. Fake news, 1, what Jon Stewart or John Oliver do, news satire, are called fake news, or what we're probably talking about today, fabricated news. But all of these terms are contested territory in an ideological and political economy that's rapidly changing. What do we mean by fake news? So the advantage of not speaking till 4 o'clock was that I was able to go on the web today and take a look at the headlines at what would normally be called the standard news media. So here's the New York Times for today with headlines about cybersecurity from the recent mass attack on a number of institutions across the globe, Google and taking over the classroom, healthcare bills, impeachment. That's mainstream Canadian, the Globe and Mail. We're talking about the home capital mortgage lender, again, cybersecurity, Trump-era Russian novel in real time, progressive US version, alternate, headlines about Donald Trump's financial ties, a link between brain damage and religious fundamentalism. Mainstream Canada, the Toronto Star, talking about Ontario Health Ministry, a specific version of that global cyber attack. Ontario plans big boost to minimum wage, overhaul of labor laws. Progressive Canadian today on Rabble was covering the Canadian Labor Congress and the Street Party. Funnily enough, that wasn't mentioned on the front pages of any of the mainstream Canadian press, talking about the Venezuelan people dying in the streets and climate change. Another progressive Canadian, and full disclosure, I used to be editor of Canadian Dimension. One of their headlines was about when communism inspired Americans, unraveling the secrets of the National Enquiry, Canada and the Pirates of the Caribbean. If you travel globally, I was in, you'll see, when I was in Frankfurt Airport about 3 weeks ago and I had a long layover, I'm sitting in one of the pods and looking at the news coming across, and there's a couple of the news that were in Frankfurt Airport, Al Jazeera. Again, the unprecedented level of the answer. Now, but we see some news about a Jordanian attacker, and Al Jazeera's journalist Free Mahmoud Hussein, who's still in jail. People remember Monsieur Fahmy, the Canadian Egyptian, who was recently progressive with a question mark. Is RT progressive? Now talking about Japan and Tomahawk compatible missiles, vandals, Catholic and Jewish headstones, Microsoft again with the security propaganda, Xinhua, the Chinese mainland paper, talking about Hassan Rouhani, talking about the cyber attack again, Indians like combat, Iraqi forces, and finally the South China Morning Post, again with the cyber attack. And U.S. and China can cooperate. What do we take from this? There was an event that was common to all of those, which was the use of the attack malware found in the Shadow Brokers release that was used to attack and bring down hospitals and institutions all over. But that seemed to be the only consensus across all of those journals today. So what do we take from that? News creation is a political act. There's events in the world that happen, and if you look at the sort of traditional media definition of who, what, where, when, and why as being the composition of the story, those are all selected in a process that's heavily ideologically mediated. And if you look at the why, we look at explanations, opinions, beliefs, and the selection of events to cover are all rooted in a political economy and in a system that's designed to do a couple of different things. And it very much depends on what the political agenda, implicit or explicit is of the media outlet. I very occasionally write a blog post, so I guess that makes me a journalist. I know Yves certainly is. He's a fairly prolific writer. And both of us come from similar but probably distinct ideological backgrounds, and you'll tell that from our writing. But the mainstream media is characterized by the mythology that, oh, we're presenting objective news, that we don't represent an ideological. We may have a political viewpoint. The Tour Star is liberal and the National Post is conservative, but we're not really ideological. We're presenting some kind of pure or objective news, and that, of course, is the real fake news. That exists. But news delivery is also an economic act, right? We're living through a transformation into a new form of accumulation that I'll talk about later. But increasingly, people are getting their news from websites. And when you travel to a website, you're not the customer, right? Who's heard this before? If you get a service for free on the internet, you're not the customer, you're the product, right? So you're giving over your personal data willingly, unwillingly, wittingly, or unwittingly, and the website is serving you content there, and they're selling some aspect of your life to data aggregators or advertisers or advertising tech companies in the back end, but also along the way. So you get your content, you get the headlines, but you also get advertising, you also get malware, and you also get surveillance. My wife grew up under the Stalinists in Poland, and when you hear the talk about metadata and the kind of data that Facebook collects, and then you look at what the collaborators and the people that cooperated with the secret police and under Stalinism collected, this is exactly what they were collecting. Who do you talk to? What are you saying? Where are you going? The vast majority of the Stasi and the other, or the right-wing secret police files, are those kind of data that we are now giving over, quote, willingly, unquote, in return for this content, and that's having a consequence. We get news from the internet. And the concern is this turning into an echo chamber? Is this turning into a place where we're all just talking to ourselves and reinforcing our own opinions? This is from a recent article on conversation.com about exactly this. So when we go searching on the internet, by the way, you all know that Google knows you better than your nearest and dearest, much more intimately. How many people have put in search terms into Google that they wouldn't talk to their partner about? Right? And they accumulate all of that. Right? How many people have gone to Facebook and shared things that they wouldn't necessarily share at the local pub? But Facebook is keeping all of that. Facebook says that if I'm an advertiser and I want to find women between the ages of 35 and 40 in a particular postal code that have a disposable income or an income of over $40,000, I can target that ad. So what this has done is putting this context of fake news in a political, economic context, right? We all go looking for news, and this is from factcheck.org. If you want to check this out, how to spot fake news. But fake news, it's fake news that fake news is new. There's quotes here. Secretary Brunel. Secretary Brunel, quoting, Secretary Brunel declares fake news about his people being telegraphed over the country. Cincinnati Commercial Tribune, 7 June, 1890. Right. The fundamental decision about privacy that created rules around privacy and protection of personal information were around paparazzi taking pictures of people inappropriately. This decision was made by Judge Brandeis in 1894. So these issues go back a long, long way. Let's talk about the Canadian context. Class and politics in Canadian media? Say it isn't so. So these 5 corporations are probably, if you listen to the media, where you're going to get the majority of your news. Bell from the 2016 BCE, which is the parent company of Bell Media, revenues are derived primarily from advertising. Remember the diagram where you give over your information? And subscriber fees. They have 30 TV stations, 30 TV specialty channels, 4 national pay TV, 105 radio stations, 200 plus websites, and an overall revenue of $21.7 billion. Put a pin in that number. Québécois has a similarly dominant position, primarily in Quebec. The major newspapers, the major radio stations, children's publishing, book publishing, and so on and so forth, with an annual revenue of $4 billion, about 1/5 of BCE, which is not unrealistically proportionate to the size of the 2 nations in the pan-Canadian state. Chorus, whose offices are down on Queen's Quay, from their 216 annual report. I love this kind of business speak. Our path has been guided by 3 strategic priorities we first put in motion in fiscal 2015 to own and control more content, to engage our audiences, don't you feel engaged? And to expand into new and adjacent markets, 1.17 billion in revenue. And so between those, that's Global and CTV, that's Chorus and Bell. CBC Radio Canada, their revenue 528 million, and they cover most of the dial across the country, with presence in small and medium cities all over the place. Another quote: further supporting our digital-first strategy, in October we launched enhanced digital and mobile local news services with content geared to each part of the day, including targeted push alerts. Are you ready to? What does this have to do with creating an informed citizenry? Not much. And New Cap Radio, which is Newfoundland capital, 95 radio stations, including, if you're from Toronto, Boom, and a bunch of country stations across, with revenues of 169 million. And you'll see, and these are all corporate entities whose primary goal is to return value to shareholders, right? That's, if you have a fiduciary responsibility, if you're on the board or on the executive team of one of these corporations, your primary goal is to return value to shareholders, not to inform citizens, not to provide quality news. Am I stealing your thunder if I quote, what's his name, the head of CBS, about Trump? You know, the head of, what's the head of CBS? Is Nunez? Les Nunez? When he said, yep, Trump is terrible for America, but he's great for CBS. Right? That captures the news industry in a bucket. You go, oh, these guys are dominant. I look at the numbers involved here. But wait, there's more. There's an emergent term called surveillance capitalism. Now, there's some Marxists in the room. How many of you have heard of MCM, money, commodity, money? One of the innovations that Marx said, from a primitive market economy where it was commodity, money, commodity, industrial and finance capitalism and advanced capitalism goes from money through commodity to money. But one of the commodities now emerging in the last 10 years is our personal data. Capitalist accumulation now accumulates our social relations as a commodity. They have commoditized our social relations. Here, by market cap, are the 10 largest companies on the American Stock Exchange, in descending order. And I've highlighted the ones that collect, use, or disclose our personal information as a key or a significant part of their business model. Apple, 730 billion. All of a sudden, BCE's 20 billion in revenue, which probably translates to about a market cap of about 100 billion. BCE doesn't make this list, not even close. And they're the companies that are providing the news. But the revenue and what drives the capitalist industry in these is the personal data. So I'm guessing that Yves is going to talk a lot about the explicit and implicit propaganda and ideological content of the news, but the news industry and its place in the political economy as an exploitation and new form of oppression, you are now truly the commodity. Google, $580 billion in market cap. And remember what I said about, business school, market capitalization. That means the total number of their shares multiplied by the share value as of, I think about 3 weeks ago. That's when these figures were taken. Microsoft, Berkshire Hathaway comes in fourth. That's, for those that follow these things, that's Warren Buffett. Amazon, Jeff Bezos. Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, right, who's now rumored to thinking about wanting to run for president. These is a new form of capital accumulation emerging, and I've left a paper. I've printed a copy of the paper out at the back. I'm not buying into it necessarily, but it's an interesting read. It's called Big Other, The Emergence of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. The paper's at the back. So fake news should be understood in the context of a particular ideological bent of neoliberal and libertarian capitalists who think it's their job to maximize revenue for themselves individually, for their corporations, on the back of your social relations. So here's what I would think fake news that you see all the time in the mainstream. Canada is not racist. Ask Desmond Cold. Ask any Indigenous person. Free trade has been good for Canada. Right. Canada is generally admired internationally. I think Yves can probably talk a bit better about that than I can. Or the middle class is the dominant middle class. These are the elements of fake news that we have to wade through every day in our search for truth and in our political activism. And they're facing a political class and business people in their day-to-day lives who I think this captures the problems we face with dealing with these people in their day-to-day lives. So much money is being made by so many people in technology that thinking that that this use and abuse of personal information and the exploitation of your personal relations has become normalized. That's the real news. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks. Thanks to Socialist Action for putting this on. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm going to basically speak about the propaganda in Canadian foreign policy. So probably, we're talking about fake news. 90% of what we hear about Lester Pearson's foreign policy, which should probably be classified as fake news. 90% of what we hear about Canada's role in Haiti should probably be classified as fake news. It's just a complete distortion from the reality. And if you bother to look, there's an abundance of evidence to suggest the case. And that sort of generalizes more broadly in Canadian foreign policy discussions. And so I did this book, came out in the fall, called The Propaganda System: How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And basically the book is trying to answer the question of why do 9 in 10 Canadians think this country is a force for good in the world, despite a long history of Canada supporting empire, historically British, today American, and advancing Canadian corporate interests abroad. That is what overwhelmingly what Canadian foreign policy is about, yet the vast majority of us, of the population, believes otherwise. And so to try to answer that question is what the objective of the book is, and then try to look at it sort of structurally, institutionally. Now, to start off with just some examples of the bias in the dominant media on foreign policy issues. Most of the bias is just ignoring certain things, right? That's the dominant. There is lying that takes place, but that's usually a secondary, component. So just one example that I looked into is Canada signed foreign investment promotion protection agreements with about a dozen African countries over the past decade or so. Basically what these agreements are about is Canadian mining companies dominate all across the continent, $30 billion of Canadian mining investment in Africa. There's lots of local opposition to these mining companies. These mining companies like the ability to sue national governments in international tribunals if they feel like their profits have been interfered with. So what these foreign investment promotion protection agreements, basically what they are is the Chapter 11 of NAFTA, give companies the ability to sue domestic governments in international tribunals, secretive international tribunals. I could not find a single criticism of a FIPA that Canada had signed with African governments. Okay, these agreements, they're not only do they give these added rights to corporations that oversee or undermine local democracy, they're also locked in for over a decade and a half. So if one government signs a FIPA with Canada, future governments are locked in. So incredibly, questionable issue, democratically, because aren't you supposed to be able to elect a new government that changes directions? So I could not find a single critical mention of a FIPA Canada signed with Africa in doing a Canadian news search and Google search. When the Canadian government, the Harper government, in April 2015 signed a FIPA with the government in Burkina Faso, this is just after there had been a popular revolt that had overthrown the Blaise Compaoré dictatorship that had been in power for 27 years. Canada brought military officials from the Burkina Faso interim government to Canada to sign this FIPA. So this is a government that had no pretense of electoral legitimacy. The Canadian government brings them to Ottawa to sign a FIPA with the Canadian government. I submitted an op-ed to Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, National Post, and others, Ottawa Citizen, on the issue. Of course, none of them were interested in publishing the matter. So incredible bias against looking at this critical question of these foreign investment promotion and protection agreements Canada signed with African governments. Another example of this, so I blog at the Huffington Post. Huffington Post, of course, is now a huge conglomerate. Their whole model is that they try to offload all the work onto unpaid individual writers like myself and others. So they make you, submit the thing, put links into it. Basically, their model is put as little effort into it as possible. So they've refused to publish lots of my stuff over the years for reasons that I deem to be political. But one example was a particularly stark example. So just after the Trudeau got elected in 2015, I wrote a blog post talking about the responsibility to protect doctrine and the Trudeau government pursuing the responsibility to protect doctrine. People are familiar with the responsibility to protect doctrine? Most people. So basically it's a liberal imperialist tool to intervene in weaker countries. And so I submitted a blog that discussed the use of the responsibility to protect doctrine in Libya in 2011 and in Haiti in 2004. And basically that's how the Canadian government justified overthrowing the elected government in Haiti in 2004. And I put links in to a couple of articles that were actually Canadian government files where they specifically cited the responsibility to protect. The Canadian ambassador in Port-au-Prince specifically cited the responsibility to protect. These were released and accessed information to justify Canada's intervention in 2004. And I submitted this to the Huffington Post, and their response was, the editor responds saying, "We need mainstream sources to verify the facts in your blog, and unfortunately the facts below are only in the publication cited or printed elsewhere by the same authors." So basically, because the dominant media of this country had not covered the use of the responsibility to protect doctrine to justify overthrowing Haiti's elected government, the Huffington Post, for the past decade, the Huffington Post was saying, no, we can't touch the issue because, again, it hasn't been reported on in the dominant media, even though we had literally the accessed information files of the ambassador citing it. Another example, in 2003, the Canadian government organized a meeting to overthrow Haiti's elected government called the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. It was actually reported on 6 weeks after the meeting took place. The Ottawa Initiative on Haiti, where they brought French, American, and Canadian officials, decided that Aristide, the elected president, must go. I did a Canadian newsstand search for the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti as part of the research for this book. There was not a single mention by a corporate reporter in the English language Canadian media, all the dominant papers in this country, about the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. So this is the Canadian government planning to overthrow an elected government, something that leads to thousands of people being killed, and it's just not a story to the dominant media in this country. So you get into the questions of the why. Why is the media so biased in favor of the dominant corporate Ottawa perspective? And you get into questions of ownership. Who owns the media in this country? Obviously, it's owned by, Canada's among the most consolidated media in the world. In the book, I show examples of owners intervening in the newsroom on foreign policy issues. The clearest example in recent years was the Aspers, and making their papers even more anti-Palestinian than they already were. Then you get to the question of where do media get their money from? Where do the papers get their money from? Well, it's primarily from advertisers. And advertisers have, who are the advertisers? Primarily major corporations that often have foreign policy, objectives and interests. So for instance, for most of the last half century, the biggest advertiser in Canadian media has been, among the biggest advertisers, been General Motors. General Motors Defense was also the biggest arms manufacturer in this country for much of that period. So the perspective of advertisers seeps into the newsroom. Then you get questions of information sources. Media dependent on other institutions or other sources of information dissemination, press releases, events, etc., etc. Well, who's got the resources to produce those events, produce media? Far and away, and I'll get to it in further detail in a second, it's the military. It's the biggest PR organization in this country. They have a huge number of people working to influence what's in our media outlets. Another element, somewhat particular to Canada, in terms of understanding the bias in foreign policy discussion, is the high dependence on U.S. wire services, dependent on Associated Press, New York Times, other international media coverage that's very much slanted in the U.S. Perspective. Also, there's the question of media institutions are responsive to pressure, like other institutions are. So when I write an email, or people in this room write an email complaining to an editor or complaining to a reporter, that has some impact. It has a whole lot more impact when it's coming from a powerful individual, or even more so when it's coming from a powerful institution. And I document examples of that flack on foreign policy issues. Most notably, the many military associated institutions have repeatedly pressured and succeeded in pressuring media on different issues. Same thing with a group like Honest Report in Canada, pro-Israel flack organization that impacts the media. Then you go into some other kind of components to the media's foreign policy discussion. You go back historically, the Canadian press. Right? The wire agency in this country, it was set up during World War I explicitly to get more pro-war propaganda into Canadian media. And there was a government subsidy that lasted for, I think it was about 6 years, to get Reuters, which at that time was under basically an arm of the British Foreign Service, to get Reuters wire service into Canadian media through the Canadian press and establishing the Canadian press. So the Canadian press's roots are explicitly tied into Canadian war propaganda, and then the Canadian press became the dominant wire service in this country during World War II, when it worked hand in glove with the Canadian military. So to the extent that you had Canadian military public relations officers fighting in Europe, one day working for the Canadian military as PR people, the next day as correspondents for Canadian press with the same unit. So literally, you're still with the same units, still the same troops. One day you're public relations military, next day you're just a reporter for the Canadian press. The extent to which the historic ties between the Canadian military, Canadian foreign policy, and Canadian press. I also go through many examples of the CBC and their very close historic ties to the Canadian military, particularly in the foreign policy establishment more generally. Now, I'm going to try to run through some of this really quickly, because some of this is, I think, quite interesting in terms of the wars. During times of war, the information control is quite elaborate in this country, has been quite elaborate. So World War I, World War II, the Korean War, there was formal censorship. And during World War I, there was actually 253 media outlets that were banned in this country, shut down. The censor's office was going into record shops and taking records off the shelf that were deemed subversive and stuff like that. Now, we don't live in a time of that formal censorship during times of war, but we still have a military that works aggressively to control the narrative during war. And there's a fair bit of academic, actually generally from a somewhat pro-military perspective on these matters that delves into this. And they comparing how the Canadian military has dealt with information control during different types of war. So when Canada was bombing Iraq in the early 90s, former Yugoslavia, late 90s, Libya 2011, Iraq more recently, these were air campaigns. And the military's main way of dealing with information control was to just exclude reporters from access to information, notably from accessing the Canadian fighter pilots that were engaged in dropping bombs. In the context when it's just dropping bombs, it's very difficult for the media to know what's going on. It's taking place at 30,000 feet. Unless you're on that flight, which is obviously not going to happen, or you're getting the information directly from the pilots, you're very dependent on the military for information. So the military's perspective in those wars has been just to exclude them, not allow pilots to be interviewed by reporters about what they're doing. That's been their primary method of controlling information. Now, they take a very different perspective on ground wars, most notably Afghanistan. Right? In Afghanistan, the military took total opposite direction, where they tried to bring reporters as close as possible. Right? That's, of course, what people in the room are familiar with, was the embedding campaign, where you bring reporters onto the Canadian base in Afghanistan. They live with the soldiers. They go out on missions with the soldiers, and the PR officials of the military work hard to shape the stories, to try to generate stories they want to be covered. And so here's Scott Taylor, a military reporter, describing Canada's embedding program and how it worked with reporters. He said, "What would you say if the Romanian military occupied your town and a Romanian tank and journalist showed up at your door? You love the government they have installed and want these guys to stay. Of course the locals are smiling when a reporter shows up with an armored vehicle and an armed patrol. No surprise, right? It's no surprise. But we never heard the military's embedding campaign, or very rarely heard it, described in that way in the dominant media in this country. And so that was really the objective. And none of this is by haphazard, right? The military is spending significant resources to debate these questions in academic journals, in their own academic journals, to figure this stuff out. It is, as I said, the largest PR organization in the country. 2010, its PR budget was $354 million, 661 staff members. How many full-time employees does the Canadian Peace and anti-war demilitarization movement have? 2, 3, right? So slight imbalance between the military's PR budget and I think I don't know if we didn't have $1 million, maybe we have $100,000 and put all the peace organizations in the country, anti-war groups, PR budgets together. Department of National Defense has 13 independent public affairs organizations within it. So 13